So we're on week 4. The first week we talked about indifference. The second week we talked about hollow worship. And last week we talked about hypocrisy. I'm sorry I don't have any masks or cool illustrations today, so I apologise. But to get into today's topic, which is a message on spiritual pride, I want to tell you guys a story. A few years ago, I decided it was a good idea to go back to study. I had done up to like my level 5, and I was like, it was pretty easy, do my bachelor, all good, let's go. But at the time I was working, and I had never worked and studied before. There's some people I adore my auntie and her ability. She had 4 kids, as well as working and finished her masters all at the same time, and I was just like, if she can do it, I can do it. It's that encouragement. Except for the fact that I quickly found that because of my habits I had in school, and I'm not trying to sound cocky when I say this, but I was one of those kids in school that could kind of skate by and not put in a lot of effort. I could do the whole procrastinate thing. Oh, it's due on Monday and it's Sunday. I can throw something together to get enough mark. And that was the kind of kid I was in school. If I actually put effort into it, sorry, it's annoying me, it's not in the middle. If I actually put effort into it, I would excel, do really good. But with math, who wants to keep doing that? So that was terrible. Anyway, so I was one of those kids. So I was used to skating through until I took my first level 7 paper. And an actual, you actually have to know what you're talking about. You can't just make it up and sound smart. And so I get to this point and I'm working, and it's a lot more difficult than I thought it was going to be. And my marks had kind of been very up and down as I was going. So I was like, oh, okay, I've procrastinated this for ages. I've got 5 days to write 4,000 words, we've got it. And so I make it to the day before and I go, Mum, can you please read this? I've done so many late nights that I think I don't make sense in what I've written. This actually doesn't make sense. So she does me the favour, she does grammar check, spell check, all that stuff, checks everything. She hands it back to me, and then I kind of look at it and I'm like, she kind of rewrote it. And I was just like, that's kind of rude. And then I was to her, I was like, you kind of rewrote it. She was like, and she shows me no, I didn't rewrite it at all. I just swapped this place to here and this thing to here, so it actually flowed and made sense better. And I was like, I don't know, I think she thinks that I don't know what I'm talking about. So I was like, actually, Mum, you didn't understand the assignment, so I'm not going to turn yours in. I'm going to hand mine in, and we'll see how we go. So I hand mine in. A few weeks later, get it back. I barely pass, barely pass. And then the guy's in the comments literally says, you know what you're talking about, but this doesn't make sense. And I was just like, oh my gosh. So he's gracious enough to say, I'm going to give you 48 hours to go through and just re-edit and reformat it and hand it back, and I'll give you a mark on that grade. And I kind of had to do the thing where I went to my mum and I was like, how I asked you to do that thing? I didn't listen and I did my own thing. And I need you to help me because I barely passed and I'm really sorry. And as all mums do, with an eye roll and okay, she does it again for me, rechecks it over, sighs, eye rolls, the whole lot. But I hand my assignment back in, a couple weeks pass again, and I got, I think, a B+ or an A-. So I was I really didn't make sense. But we all come to that point, where we have to do the thing where you're I'm right, you're wrong. Then we find out that we're wrong and they were right. And then you have to do the kind of, I'm sorry, my bad, kind of a thing. And grease up to the person and be sorry, my bad. And our pride and our ego takes a little bit of a hit, right? And that's because why pride comes before a what? A fall. So what would Jesus undo this morning? I believe he would undo spiritual pride. Why? Because I believe that he doesn't want us to experience the fall that comes after pride. Something I've learned as I've got older, and especially growing up with the parents that I have, and in the community that I've grown up with, and in the family I've grown up with, one of the most loving things you can do for another person is look them in the eye and tell them the truth, right? Sometimes it's one of the most hurtful things that your family can do for you, but it's also one of the most loving. And I believe that Jesus' words today, and they have been through this whole series, they've been looking us in the eye and telling us the truth. And so what would Jesus undo? It's spiritual pride. In Luke 18, 9 to 14, Jesus tells us the story of two guys who go to the same place for the same purpose. The first being a Pharisee and the second a tax collector. They're on their way to the temple to pray, and Jesus tells us that one of them leaves justified and righteous in God's eyes, and the other one doesn't. In Luke 18, verses 9 to 10, it says, "Now he also told this parable to some people who trusted in themselves, that they were righteous and viewed others with contempt. Two men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector." So he, being Jesus, tells a parable. If you don't know what a parable is, that's a story that's intended to teach. But he doesn't tell this story to everybody, right? He only tells it to some people who trusted in themselves. They put hope in themselves. They put faith in themselves. Why? Because they believed they were righteous. I do the right things. I say the right things. I'm good. I've got this kind of attitude. I'm right before God. And because they viewed themselves as righteous, it says they viewed others with contempt. And that's because our relationship with God, our relationship in the vertical, can't be good if our relationship in the horizontal with others isn't. The vertical always impacts the horizontal, and the horizontal always impacts the vertical. So Jesus is speaking to a very specific audience when he shares this, and he says, two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. So we have the benefit of reading the Bible before and hearing lots of stories, so we know Pharisees aren't actually all that they're cracked up to be, right? That back then, in the Bible, the Pharisee is like, he's a holy man, he's a respected man, he's supposed to be the good guy, a religious leader in his community. In fact, he knows all 613 laws in the Old Testament and he lives by them, right? He was like a pastor going to church in our modern day equivalent. Whereas if we look at the tax collector, he is someone that's despised, that's a fraud, that's hated by his community. He betrayed them. He steals money from his community, from his family members, people he grew up with, was loved by, enjoyed meals with, and gives it to an empire that is now sitting over him and oppressing the people oppressing his family and his community and the people of his country. And on top of that, he takes a little bit of extra money on top to make himself wealthy. He is heavily despised. He would be, I guess, trying to find a comparison like a corrupt politician who's lining his own pockets instead of giving money to those in need in his community. Or maybe a drug dealer that's sending drugs out to people in his own neighborhood, in his own family, corrupting them so that he would gain wealth. This is how despised the tax collector is and how respected the Pharisee is. And they go to the temple to talk to God. It would be like almost like a joke kind of thing. They're like, a Pharisee and a tax collector go into a bar. But, it's so completely different. It would almost be like saying Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader go to the temple. Or Mufasa and Scar go to the temple. So Luke 18, 11 to 12 says, "The Pharisee stood and began praying this in regard to himself. God, I thank you that I am not like other people, swindlers, crooked, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I pay tithes of all that I get." A little bit up himself, right? The Pharisee stood, and it says in the Bible, right, that he was praying this in regard to himself. So you could say in this way, the Pharisee stood up by himself and separated himself from the others that were in the same place to do the same thing as what he was doing. And he prays to God, "Thank you, I'm not like these other people." God, I thank you that I'm not a swindler, I'm not unjust or adulterer or like this lowly tax collector, because I fast twice a week and I pay tithes of all that I get. The Pharisee said this: God, thank you that I do the right things, and thank you that I'm better than everybody else that's here. And get this, like, if we're being completely honest, the Pharisee wasn't completely wrong. He wasn't. He was a well-respected person, and he had a really lot of good things going on in his life. By the age of 12, he knew the whole Torah, which is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Like, not just the names of them like we do when we're 12, like every single word in those books. And yeah, he spent time in God's word all the time. He was trying to study it. He was trying to know it. He tried to do what was right in his life and followed the rules and did all the perfect things. And he had some really good things going. The Pharisee wasn't completely wrong. He had much to be proud of, but instead of realizing what he had as a gift from God, he saw himself as a gift to God. And before we look down at our noses, like at the Pharisee, like, ooh, tis Pharisee, why do you think like that? Would be wise to recognize and acknowledge that there's a Pharisee that lives inside of all of us. Instead of, God, thank you so much that I get to be a part of this church where I see you move every single week, it's, God, you're welcome, I showed up today, the weather's really nice and I could have gone fishing. Or instead of, God, thank you for these children that you've blessed me with, that I get to guide them and I get to help them grow in their spiritual walk. It's, you're welcome, I take them to Sunday school. My parents didn't do that with me. Because we stop seeing the good things in our life as a gift from God, and we begin to see ourselves as the gift to God. We begin to experience spiritual pride. And why do we do that? I think it's because spiritual pride promises three things that it actually doesn't fulfill. The first is self-sufficiency. You know, like, I've got this. I don't need anything else. Like, I don't need anyone else. Like, look at what I've accomplished on my own. Look at how I've done this. I have it all together. Look at all the good things, all the right things I'm doing. I'm a good person. Like, I'm sufficient. Second thing is self-importance. You know, I have value. I live in the right neighborhood. My kids go to the right school. I serve in a host team, and by the way, that host team could not run without me. Or I go to a connect group and I'm the glue that holds everyone together. I have value. I'm important. The last one is that it falsely promises self-exaltation. I am better. Everyone, look at me. Look at the label I've got on my purse. Look at the label I've got on my car. There's red bottoms on the bottom of these shoes. If you know that, only the women were like, oh, I got that. All the men, it's like, woo. Anyways, and yet spiritual pride, right, is this inward emotion that leads to outward actions that we would never normally want to be associated with, right? For example, I had a friend who, when we were in high school, you know, it was like the race to get your licenses, you know what I mean, to try and, you know, because you want to be independent as soon as possible. There's some kids at youth, I'm like, why haven't you got your license yet? They're like, Mum and Dad can just drive me around forever. But I was not that kid. I was the kid that was going to get my license, wanted that independence straight away. And so we were all at a race to get our licenses, and then one thing happened that was so unfair, because we all got our licenses at the same time, but one of my friends got a car for free from her parents. And we heard about this, and we're like, this is so unfair, until I saw the car, and then I was like, I'm good. Because this was a bright orange Nissan March, like 2005, that it had been cobwebs in it at some points. There was like melted milkshake and ice cream in it that like the smell was just terrible. You had to drive with the windows down all the time, otherwise you just suffocate from the cream, the old cream. And she would be like, guys, jump in with me, and we'd all be like, nah, we're going to take my mum's car instead. And you know, your mum's car is supposed to be a little bit embarrassing, driving in your mum's car, but I was not going to be caught dead in this bright orange Nissan March that smelled like cream. And so if I did ever indulge her, because she was always like, come, just like let me drive. And if I ever did indulge her, I was like, where are we going? Are there going to be people there? Because I don't want them to see me get out of this car. Anyways, a few years later, she's also the first to upgrade her car, right? So she gets a 3-year-old Mazda 3. It's silver this time, not orange. So it's a bit of an upgrade. The other thing I forgot to tell you is that in her old car, she had like fluorescent floor mats and a cheetah print steering wheel cover. And that also added to the ambience of like just not wanting to be in there. But this car had like normal floor covers and it didn't have an ugly steering wheel cover on it. So I was like, oh, what an upgrade. And then my attitude just completely changed. She's like, oh, can you drive? I'm like, no, we're taking your flash new car. I'm not driving. We're taking your car everywhere all the time. And it was weird, right? Because we still hung out at the same places. We still did the same things. My friend was still the same person. Nothing had changed but the car, and I was acting different. The car had changed, so did my outward actions, because my inward emotions towards the car was drastically different, right? And spiritual pride is the exact same way. We fall into this trap of thinking that my ultimate value is based on my accomplishments or the gifts that people give me or I give to others, or my ability to follow the rules or how I compare to others. And our inward emotion leads to outward action. So we aren't that different from the Pharisee, right? Our pride, that inward emotion, leads to outward action that we would never normally be associated with. You know, the people whose value comes from accomplishments because they post what they're doing on Instagram all the time, or on Facebook, like those freaky people that are like, 2024 wrapped. I had 2 kids, ran a half marathon and finished my master's degree. And you're just like, well, my biggest accomplishment this year is that I finished a book that I started in May of 2023. Like, you know? And then, people that need others to look at what they've done. They need to know, and they need to show you how important and worthy they are. Or maybe there's people that have to compare their value, and you often know who they are because you hear them say things like, look at what they're wearing. I wouldn't be caught dead wearing that. Or look at their kids. They're so misbehaved. My kids would never be like that. Parents, I've like entered the parent world through like friends, and oh my gosh, some parents are so mean. It's one of the hardest things I think can go through. Or maybe at work you hear that person that's always like, Joe's such a kiss up. He's always doing that for the boss. Or you catch yourself saying, I would never do that, and pointing to a very specific person. It's easier to feel value, right, when we lift yourself up by pushing others down. Maybe it's through rule following. That's like a classic oldest child thing, where you're just like, how come so-and-so, my younger brother, doesn't have to do this, and I had to when I was his age? That's so unfair. I'm a good person. I was way better than him when he was this age. And then that slowly develops as you get older into, how come God's blessing them? I'm better than they are. How I'm better than most Christians, yet I don't see God in my situation. Or even to a really terrible degree of, oh, they really need God. I don't need God like that. I don't struggle. I don't need the help that they do. That's embarrassing. Or maybe your pride and your issue, attention seeking, helps you find value. Look at me. Maybe you're the person that's the complete opposite that the person before was complaining about. You come out onto the altar like you stubbed your toe and you're coming onto the altar crying like, I'm going through such hardship. Oh, people don't like that one. Look at me looking around during worship. I'm going to format the perfect Instagram post that sums up how smart I am thinking about this one Bible verse, but really it was like someone else shared it and I just copy and pasted it and put it on my Instagram so I seem really smart and in touch with the world and the Lord. And if you struggle with any of these things, we'll move on from that, people don't like it. If you struggle with any of these things, the inward emotions felt often leads to actions that would be embarrassed by. that we don't love about ourselves when we do them, but we can't help it, that we don't want others to associate us with, right? And some of us, you're like, get real, we live in New Zealand. Short poppy syndrome's like a real thing. Tall poppy, syndrome's a real thing, you know? And it's probably only a small amount of us that suffer those things in that way. But I think like in this culture, it's way more likely that you actually suffer with reverse spiritual pride. Thinking you're not trying to convince God and others that you're awesome all the time. You're just trying to convince God and others that you're like subpar, that you're average, that you're okay. Or maybe you just feel like that's an impossible task altogether. Most of us here today struggle with insecurity and that reverse spiritual pride. Like there's people here where you have conversations with them and they can't even receive a compliment. I go, your shoes are really cool, your outfit's really cool. Oh, I got it on sale, I'm just lucky. No, you like curated a really cool outfit. No. Or maybe some of you say things and I've heard it like, I could never be as free in worship as that person is. I see how Anna Cooper gets on the floor, on the ground, and I want to do that, but I could never be as free of people's opinions as she is. Or I could never post about my faith on social media. I don't want people to think that I'm a weirdo or anything like that. Or God could never use me in leadership because of what I've done in my past. Look at that. God couldn't use me. I could never share my faith at work because they know the other side of me that's not as great as the person I am on a Sunday morning. And there's probably some of us that are even stuck in a woe is me mindset that feel like it's literally impossible to do anything like that, where you think, my life is so bad, my kids deserve better than what I can give them. My friends deserve better, and my job deserves better, whatever it is. And we just get so stuck in this mindset that being prideful is the least of our concerns. Just having a little bit of self-confidence is the thing that we need most. But the problem with reverse spiritual pride is the same as overt spiritual pride, because it starts with me. And my value is based on what I can or I can't accomplish. It's based on my ability to follow the rules or my inability to follow the rules. It's based on the attention I receive or the attention I don't get, or how I compare to everyone else, just like the Pharisee. So what would Jesus undo? He would undo spiritual pride. If you're taking notes, I'd love for you to write these next 3 points down. The first thing is, when we are full of ourselves, there is no room for God. Just look at the Pharisees' prayer, I've got it together, I'm better than everybody else. There's no room for God in that. That's all about me. But Jesus offers us a better way. In Luke 18:13 it says, but the tax collector, standing some distance away, was even unwilling to raise his eyes towards heaven, but was beating his chest, saying, God, be merciful to me, the sinner. He was standing some distance away. He couldn't even bring himself to the altar of the temple. And he was unwilling to lift his eyes, instead saying, God, have mercy on me. Don't give me justice, even though that's what I deserve. Don't give it to me. Have mercy on me because I'm a sinner. He understands one thing, and it's that if God doesn't intervene in his story, he is hopeless. He understands that if God doesn't intervene, he's hopeless. Because back in those days, especially in his situation, there was only one way to be made right under the law for him. It would be to pay every single person he ever took money from back plus 20%. That's an impossible task. It's just not happening in the career that he's in. Unless he somehow inherits freaking a community's worth of money, it's not happening. And he knows that. Who could do that? God. He needed God to intervene in his situation because it was hopeless. Jesus continues on, and it says this in verse 14. I tell you, this man went to his house justified rather than the other one. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Jesus shocks the crowd here, right? The Pharisee, the pastor, he's going home being looked at not in right eyes by God, but like he's in the wrong. And the drug dealer, the corrupt politician, the whoever it is, Scar from The Lion King, is going home, and he is justified, while the Pharisee remained full of spiritual pride. The tax collector emptied himself with a humble heart. And this could be an accurate picture of your spiritual condition for some of you. Maybe some of you are just like this tax collector, and you're in a hopeless situation and you just need God to intervene, and maybe you're right on the edge of, I don't know, at the end of the thread, but can I tell you one thing, that this is the perfect position for you. Why? Because when we empty ourselves, we are in the perfect position to be filled by God's grace. This is the challenge of spiritual pride, right? There's no silver bullet. It's not like the Matrix where you take the red pill or the blue pill. It's not a one-time prayer or anything like that. Undoing spiritual pride, it's like what Shrek says, like onions have layers and so do ogres, so does spiritual pride, it has layers. And you know, sometimes when you peel an onion, it hurts your eyes, makes you cry, and so does spiritual pride. It's like peeling an onion. I thought it would be hypocritical after Rimmer's message last time to be like, you guys need to work on your spiritual pride and not talk about myself and my own journey, so I'm going to talk about it. Back when I was 19 years old, I had the privilege of becoming the leader of Revive Youth, and this was like, 2019-ish, and so it was like a good time, and it was fun and going well, and everything was like blazing. We like launched into Revive Youth, gave away all these free shirts. It was so cool. Everyone was super happy, and it was all good. And then, you know, as all stories end, COVID happened. Oh, everyone hates it. My biggest hater in life is COVID. Anyway, so COVID happens, and we're like, all good. It's probably going to blow over in a few weeks, so we'll just keep sticking with what we're doing. We'll do online connect groups. We'll just text and talk to the kids to make sure we stay connected until we come back. But as you know, it wasn't a couple weeks. It wasn't even a couple months. It was a couple years, right? And so time goes on, and we see engagement become less. Not as many likes on social media on our Revive Youth posts. Oh no. Not as many people showing up to connect groups. Sometimes it's like all the leaders and then one kid, and you're like, oh, awkward. Or things like that. And slowly but surely, we get into I think 2022-ish, and we're finally able to come back and meet together. And I was like, this is going to be epic. This is going to be awesome. This is going to be the best. And I realized that what I was measuring wasn't truly what God wanted me to measure, because I was looking at a room where I used to have 40 to 50 kids there, and now 2 years later there's 12 kids. And I'm supposed to be the leader, right? I'm supposed to be the one that knows what we're doing. I'm supposed to be the one that's lifting everyone's spirits, but I'm the one that's feeling down. Or I'm supposed to be the one that knows what to do, but I'm just as clueless as everybody else, right? And I start to feel like a failure, like I wasn't doing a good job, that I was incompetent, like I was someone who ruined a good thing because they didn't know what they were doing. And some of you have been in that situation before, right? Where something's happened and you just don't know how to fix it. There's a problem and it's exhausting because you just feel like you can never find the solution. Maybe you have a child that's gone off the rails. You've tried everything and you just don't know how to help them. Maybe you look up and your financial situation is a mess and you don't know how to dig yourself out of the hole. Maybe your marriage has been rough for years and you're trying everything to make it work, let alone make it a great marriage. These situations are places where we can find ourselves stuck and it becomes isolating, depressing, and maddening. And I remember in my situation, it came to a point where I was just having like prayer fights with God. Have you ever had a prayer fight with God before? Do you know what I'm talking about? Where you're like praying, but you're not actually praying. You just went, and God, you did this, and you said you were going to do this, and you're just fighting, and he's just like this the whole time, kind of a thing. And then you just wait later until he like proves that he's right and you're wrong, and you're like, oh, dang. Anyways, so I was having a good prayer fight with God, and my prayer fights happen in my journal or on my phone, where I'll like type out a stream of consciousness where I'm like rapid typing and getting like all worked up and crying and getting angry, and that's what my prayer fights with God look like. I don't know what yours look like. Anyways, so that's how it looks like. And I'm just saying all this stuff like, God, you said this was going to happen, and you said this was going to happen, and I've had this prophesied over me, and this prophesied over me, and I've done every single thing I can think of, every single thing I thought would work, and you just let it fail. You just let me down. And this was a battle. This isn't like a one-time prayer fight, you know. Good prayer fights last like a few months. And so this had lasted a while, and I remember we had a YouFX event on, and I had already gotten myself bummed out about it, right? Because I looked around the room, and there weren't as many kids as I thought should be there. I was like, oh, we put on all this stuff. We do free food, and we do this. We're just wasting our money, blah, 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 and get into this mindset. And then I have this moment, and we're in worship, and I look around the room, and every single kid there has their arms raised and their eyes closed. And then you know how God gets smug sometimes? He just kind of says to me, is this enough? Does this make it worth it? Would you rather have a room full of kids engaging with me, worshipping their Saviour, wanting to hear the word of God? Or would you rather a room triple the size of kids that are just here for a mechanical bull outside? And I felt like God was saying to me, all I ever did, these last 2 months, all I ever did through you was just give you this group of kids to impact. Just this small group of kids that you think is insignificant. If this is all I ever gave you to, speak through, to be empowered through, and to just help them through life, if this was all I ever gave, was this be enough for you? And in that moment, I truly believed in my heart, yes. I had postured myself like the Pharisee. And God was saying, you can do that as long as you want. You can keep turning around, looking at what I did for you, look at what I've been doing, look how hard I've been working. I'm doing so much more for you than other people, than other friends. I'm giving so much. But I was never going to find what I was looking for, because what I was looking for was an unattainable goal. And I was just building a prison for myself to live in. But Jesus shows us that we can choose a better way, right? To choose the tax collector's way, to say, God, you've done more than I deserve, you've done more than I can earn, because without you, my situation is hopeless. And God looked me in the eye in that moment, and he told me the truth. And I walked through some personal pain. I had to do some personal growth, because thankfully God doesn't go, oh, while you're going through this stuff, you can look after all these kids and try and do your best. He's like, no, it's small for a reason. And I had to learn a lot of things about myself. I had to walk through some personal trauma. I had to walk through just some growth and spiritual growth and leadership growth. And to be honest, it was probably the 2021, 2022, probably been the hardest years of my life, where it just felt like every single thing was a learning experience, where every single thing God was testing me, and every single thing God was trying to get me to grow. And it shaped me who I needed to be to get out of the stuck, right? To get out of the mud. And to be honest, what God did for me in that period of my life, I never want to go through that ever again. But I'm so thankful that I did, and I wouldn't trade it for anything, because when you empty yourself Not only are you in the perfect position to receive God's grace, but when we empty ourselves, we are in the perfect position to be used by God. I've had people ask me before, like the stage preaching here is like a kind of a new thing, and then, like playing on keys sometimes, and like that's kind of where you see me most on a Sunday, right? And so I've had people ask me like, when it's like a lot of people, or like when you're getting up to preach, do you get nervous? And if I'm being honest, before, my answer 100% yes. Like I'll be like you'll see my hand shake. Like my biggest like scare thing is like doing communion, and I'm holding the communion cup, and it's just like goes everywhere, and I'm like wearing a white shirt. That's like my nightmare. And my answer before, used to be yes, I do get nervous, but now my answer is no, and I think it's because I've served enough, and I've grown enough, and I've played enough bung notes, and I've made enough mistakes with my mouth like I just did just then and not made sense, that I know that I'm not amazing enough or unimpressive enough. I'm not too big or too small to be used by God. I'm not too big or too small or too amazing or too unimpressive to stop God from moving. And if I do become too big or too small or too impressive or not impressive enough, I know that God's going to give me an attitude adjustment or a character building test. And if you're an older person in this room, or you've been walking this faith for a long time, you try to avoid those as much as possible, right? Because you've been through them and you know you don't want to do them anymore. So you learn quicker as you get older, I hope. So when you humble yourself before God, when you empty yourself, you're not operating out of a position of weakness. Humility is a position of strength. Humility is a position of strength, but not my strength, not my sufficiency, not my importance, not my exaltation, but it is through Jesus Christ, that God is sufficient through him, and he is enough for me. And he is enough for me whether he uses me in a spectacular way that I could never even dream of, or if he uses me in a humbling way. If my dreams never come true, but he still uses me to impact those around me, I think that should be good enough for us when we get what we don't deserve. If doing my best at work, going home, loving my spouse, raising my future kids, and never seeing results outside of that, I think that should be enough for me. Because that's more than I deserve. It's more than I can earn. And so Jesus Christ is enough. And that is the most confidence-building situation we could ever find ourselves in. Because God has called you and he's equipped you, and he wants his name to be lifted up through you. Can I just get the keys up, please, Jake? And you might be here in this room and you're thinking, Maddie, that's awesome for you. Like, you shared a story of working in church and you're doing all of that stuff. That's really cool, but I'm just a stay-at-home mum. There is no such thing as just in the kingdom of God. There is no such thing as just in the kingdom of God. He has called you, he's equipped you, and he will be glorified through you. He's given you a gift in your children, and he's equipped you to be the best mother that you could ever be for them. Out of all the mothers he chose you for this child. No one else who walks the face of the earth would be able to show them and love on them and change the lives of them as good as you could. And that impact is going to change not only your children's lives, but their children's lives, and eventually your whole family. And the name of Christ is going to be lifted up through you. Or maybe that's not your situation. Maybe you're like, that's awesome, but I'm just a construction worker or a cleaner or a truck driver or a barista or an accountant. It doesn't matter what you do. There's no such thing as just in the kingdom of God. You're placed on a mission field that I will never walk on to show the love of Christ to people that you work with. That's a blessing. And then on Sunday mornings, as you do this 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, maybe you hang out with the Ignite or Spark kids and you show them what it looks like to be a man or woman walking in, the life of God. You don't need to be a pastor or a minister to be like, oh, I'm called enough to talk to kids. What are they most likely going to be? They're going to be cleaners and accountants and baristas and whatever you are as well. You're the most helpful person to help these kids walk through that.
Yeah, that's good.
Or you're going to pick up that guitar that you put down in your late teens, early 20s, and you're going to decide, nah, I'm going to dedicate my practice time to God, and I'm going to bring Him glory through those hours and years of practicing where I was just practicing it to impress a girl. Instead, I'm going to use it to, bless God. Or maybe you're someone that's going to join the host team, and your smiling face and your handshake welcomes people that are lost in the community. That makes them feel the compassion that God has for them and the welcoming presence that God wants them to have. And you're going to show them the joy He feels when people start a journey with Christ. Because pride is about my glory, but humility is about God's glory. Humility is about God's glory, but how do we do that? How do we do that in our everyday lives? How do we embrace humility and empty ourselves before God? I just want to give you one thing. I believe in the one thing message. If you remember my message before, just one thing. Ask yourself, when you start to feel those emotions coming up, when you start to see that your actions are reflecting something that you don't want to be associated with, ask yourself, is this about my glory, or is this about God's glory? This emotion, this fear, this anxiety, this anger, this pride, this insecurity, this indecision, is this about my glory or God's glory? Because pride promises you freedom through being enough, but it delivers a prison of an unattainable goal, whereas humility offers a freedom you can't experience outside Jesus Christ. Is this about my glory or God's glory? Matthew 5:16 says, your light must shine before people in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds. That they may see your good deeds and glorify who? Our Father who's in heaven. What would Jesus undo? He'd undo spiritual pride. God has called you. He's equipped you. He's going to use you to bring glory to His name. The problem with pride is that when we're full of ourselves, there's no room for God. But that's not going to be us, because we're going to empty ourselves just like the tax collector. We're going to empty ourselves and find ourselves in the perfect position to be filled with grace and the perfect position to be used by God. And how do we empty ourselves? We ask ourselves the question, is this about my glory, or is this about God's glory? I just want everyone to close your eyes, bow their